The Jews of Morris and Sussex, early settlers and synagogues before World War II. My name is Linda Forgosh, and I am the Outreach Director for Morris and Sussex and the curator of this exhibition. The items that you are about to see, meaning the photographs, the minutes ledgers, the burial ledgers, the synagogue memorabilia, and the various other personal collections that are in this exhibition have been donated by the various Morris Sussex synagogues. Copies have been made at local libraries, items from historical societies, and most interestingly and the most enjoyable is the enthusiastic reception given by Morris Sussex residents, and the opportunity to donate their personal collections has meant a great deal all the way around, both to the society and to the community. So let us talk about what we're about to see today. This exhibition focuses primarily on the 6 Jewish communities who established synagogues and congregational cemeteries in Morris and Sussex counties. They are Dover and Franklin, they are Newton and Morristown, and Pinebrook and Mount Freedom. What separates them is the unique way that Jews were attracted to settle in these communities. Dover and Franklin were mining towns, Dover for iron ore and Franklin for zinc. Pinebrook and Mount Freedom were farming communities established with the funds from the Baron de Hirsch Fund, which is well documented in American history and of course Jewish history. And Morristown and Newton, which were market towns. In the cases of Dover and Franklin and Morristown and Newton, Jews established central business districts. They were first peddlers to the area, and that eventually led to storefronts. But how do we start with this history? Probably going back to the earliest records that I could find, which say that Jews settled in Morris County in the town of Morristown. It was the Civil War, approximately 1865, and the name was Sire, Henry and Rosina Sire of Morristown, who sold horses and remounts to the Union Army, and the year was 1865. I've assembled on the boards for the purpose of exhibition photographs that tell the history of these 6 100-year-plus Jewish communities. Possibly it would be the best starting point to come to the left, the top left of the exhibition, where you will see the Pinebrook Jewish Center, once known as Havra Agudat Achim Anshi. It is the oldest congregation in Morris County, and it was established in 1896. What you see is the present-day congregation. The original congregation has now become a Korean church. You see the sanctuary as you would see it in 2002. But the real history starts somewhere around 1881 with the arrival of Pinebrook's first Jewish family. And they are Lena and Joseph Connor. The Connors had come from Newark, New Jersey. Mr. Connor was a relatively successful businessman who probably worked very hard raising his family and had gotten very ill. And under doctor's advice, it was suggested that the Connors move from Newark to Pinebrook or someplace in the country. It just happened that there was a farm available in Pinebrook about 12 miles from Newark, and they bought the farmland. Now, Mr. Connor was not a very good farmer. He didn't have a great deal of experience. But Mrs. Connor, however, was a very, very excellent cook. Her reputation preceded her. One thing led to another, and before we knew it, a series of farmhouses became boarding houses in the summer months. In essence, providing services for Newark residents and surrounding cities, probably more so Newark, that I would cut, for the purpose of having kosher entertainment and just getting out of the urban atmosphere into the country air of New Jersey. This led to the establishment of the first kosher hotel in Pinebrook, which, although a little shady possibly in your video, is this image of the first kosher hotel in Pinebrook, the Sunrise Hotel, established in 1903. This led, because it was so successful, to other Jews also establishing kosher hotels in the area, and the names are recorded in various local histories. It was a challenge to get the guests from the the surrounding areas to the hotel. First, it was a challenge to climb the 104 steps. And second of all, it was a case of picking the guests up that came in from Newark to Caldwell by train. And this was the start of what we know in 2002 as the Kiva Connor bus service and Connor Chevrolet, because here is the first omnibus service that was started in 1912, and once again a way to attract summer visitors to the boarding houses and hotels in Pinebrook. It was also an area where farmers had come, Jewish farmers, who purchased land by means of funds from the Baron de Hirsch Fund, which I had mentioned previously. And we have photographs of the four-generation Bader family that still exists and is in business on Change Bridge Road. Now, the congregation celebrated its 100th anniversary in 1996, and visitors to the exhibition can read the high points of the Pinebrook Jewish Center from the start all the way up to 2002. We move on 3 years later. Not that Jews weren't living in Morristown. We had suggested that with the presence of the Sire family, who were enormously successful. 5 places, 5 rented halls, were used by the various members of the congregation for minions and activities that went on in the Jewish community. And eventually, just out of sheer necessity, the conversation led itself to the establishment of a permanent synagogue, or what they refer to as a Jewish center, where all activity, Jewish life, religious, social, sports, anything you could think about would be conducted. The building that you see on top, the Morristown Jewish Center, is exactly as you see it if you travel down Speedwell Avenue in Morristown today. It is located in historic Speedwell, which is part of the New Jersey State Register of Historic Sites and Districts. And the synagogue sanctuary, as it would have been dedicated in 1929. Now, Morristown had a special place in American history. It has been incorporated into the chapters that have been written about America's, what was referred to in the early 1900s as the Gilded Age. Morristown was referred to as the quiet city of millionaires. The year was 1902, and the source was the New York Herald newspaper. What sets this possibly to maybe pay attention to it a little closer in terms of its relationship to the larger area, that Morristown was not really the Wild West as many might have perceived it. We see this dedication ceremony of the congregation. The year is 1929, 7 months before the stock market crash. We see that the coverage is, in case I repeated myself, the New York Times, and all the individuals that had built a successful, prosperous downtown business district, assembled their monies and constructed this quite significant domed architecture, which was prominent in synagogue architecture at that time, to accommodate the Morristown Jews, and of course Jews that would be attracted from surrounding communities, because I should emphasize that Jews lived in other portions of Morris and Sussex. It's just that they did not establish congregational synagogues, or for that matter, congregational cemeteries. And they pretty much came to Morristown, or later on to Dover Jewish Center. We have a series of photographs that take us back to the 1930s, right after the congregation opens its doors at the present site. They're quite charming. Individuals come through and they recognize themselves, and it's quite wonderful, the willingness to share personal history. The stories are really quite special. But the heart of Morristown's Jewish community was reflected not only in its synagogue, but also on what was known as Speedwell Avenue, which you can see here. Looking down Speedwell Avenue with a close eye, you would be able to distinguish the names of Blick Hardware or Sally Brothers, men's store, men's clothing store, and the merchants were a quite influential association as a body. You see them pictured here somewhere around 1924. I've yet to identify them all, but we're working on it. Maybe someone viewing this video might have some memories and might be able to lend a little information as to who really made this history. Captured here for the purpose of just overall interest, you can take an opportunity to review what was referred to as the Avenue, Speedwell Avenue. This is where Jewish merchants made their home, and all the activities and the names of the individual merchants would be here. They are the record of the Jewish community from the 20s, 30s, and 40s up to World War II. This, of course, is a charming photo selected just because the young women here are very, very young as brownies. And of course, you know, as they come through, because many live in the area, they recognize themselves, and many duplications have been made for this photograph for various sentimental reasons. In chronological order, in terms of the way congregations were established, we switch from Morris County to Sussex County. To the top, you will see a newspaper photograph of the synagogue that is in Franklin, New Jersey. It is now Temple Shalom of Succotash, but when this would have been purchased by the Jews who settled in Franklin in 1917, it would have been known as Congregation Sons of Israel. You see a quite attractive setting here. The photograph was taken in 2000. This is the synagogue sanctuary, completely refurbished by the Jews in Franklin to place a central bimah. What you cannot see is the seating that comes, I guess, in front of the bimah, but you can see the backs of the heads here in the photograph to orient you to understand that this bimah is in the center of the floor. It is a facility that was built in 1823 and was for church tenures before the Jews purchased it, and it became a synagogue. But Franklin had a unique history in and of the fact that it would be referred to in 2002 as a company town. Franklin's Jews were attracted to the miners who came by droves to work in the zinc ore mines that were discovered, the zinc deposits in Franklin and nearby Ogdensburg in the 1890s. They came, they were Russians, they were Hungarians. Mexican miners would be found. And the advantage that the Jews who came to Franklin had was that they came from parts of Europe that they were able to speak the language of the miners. So it was quite successful from the get-go. The first Jews settled in Franklin in 1902, and the name is Mindlin. These are the first families, Mindlin. And of course, what is not unusual for Jews settling in a place, one came, a brother came, a sister came, a family came, and before you knew it, as this photograph would represent, which I refer to in Yiddish as the ganze Mishpacha, all the Jews in Franklin in 1925 are assembled here at a 25th anniversary of Abraham and Anna Mindlin, and everybody there owned a store, and everybody there was related. They were mishpacha. The synagogue was Orthodox. All of the synagogues that I present here today were Orthodox when they were first established. And in this case, the women in Franklin sat upstairs because it was an Orthodox community, and the men sat downstairs. As time went on, men were joined by women downstairs, but men sat on one side and women sat on another. The part of this board devoted to Franklin's history is this photograph right in the middle. The Jewish resident is Rose Solomon. The year is 1922, and the backdrop may be difficult to see clearly, is the landscape of the New Jersey Zinc Company and the railroad tracks that ran through after the zinc was mined. It was placed on the trains and distributed to various areas to be processed. This was a company town. The Jews, meaning the merchants, had a very amiable relationship with the zinc company. The zinc provided services, band concerts, swimming lessons, ice skating activities, neighborhood house for card games, for local teachers to stay over. They did everything. Nothing happened in Franklin, and the Jewish merchants went right along with them. It was not unusual sometimes for a miner to fall into arrears, and suddenly the merchant indicated to the zinc company, you know, so-and-so owes me such and such amount of money, and the company would say there is no problem. And sure enough, at the end of the week, until the wages were completely garnished and the debt was paid, the zinc company made sure the merchant got what was owed him. And here are a list of all the merchants. The reason that it is doubly significant is that what you see here are the sum total of all the Jewish families that would have lived in Franklin before World War II, never numbering more than 25 or 26. By the way, the information that I give you, much of it has been secured by oral histories that have been conducted with very enthusiastic Morris, Sussex residents who've been more than willing to share their history. And I should mention, in case I do forget, that all the items that are in this exhibition are part of the permanent collection of the Jewish Historical Society of Metro West, and we welcome all to visit. And of course, We have 80 cubic feet of historical documents, most of it all original, and historians are welcome to research as well. Adjacent to Franklin was neighboring Newton. Newton's Jews came in the late 1890s, not many of them. In fact, by 1920, there were probably only 11 families, but 10 was the magic number for Jews to start to think about a formal congregation. In 1924, Newton's Jews, the Jewish families, also whom were merchants primarily, purchased the synagogue you see on top on Washington Street. The sanctuary, which is what you would see if you came in the year 2002, was constructed in 1951. It was in response to the wave, and I guess it's relative in numbers, but the influx of Jews and servicemen after World War II who made their way, Jewish, obviously, to settle or to resettle at Newton. And there was a burst of energy that many of the members of the congregation thought would sustain the congregation. As a centerpiece, and visitors can see the names of the merchants. Once again, all the merchants were members of the synagogue. They were one and the same. The Y that was constructed, or without walls, I should say, in Newton, showed the same membership as the synagogue. There were never many Jews in Newton for various reasons, which I would not dwell on because I think that we'll stick to the positive. But in this center, because of the remote nature of Newton, it is somewhat interesting to talk about the fact that of all the congregations that are featured here, this congregation had the most trouble finding, securing, and holding a rabbi, also for various reasons, mostly because it was difficult to support a full-time rabbi. This is, for 2002, maybe a pretty unsophisticated way to conduct what is referred to as a rabbi search. The merchants were responsible for finding the rabbi, and the rabbi would be invited by an ad placed in a New York newspaper, because most of the rabbis came from New York City at this moment in the early 20s, 30s, before World War II. And this merchant, whose name still has not come to me yet, owned the Kitty Teen Shop on Spring Street in Newton, and his way of doing the rabbi search was merely recording the information that he got on the receipts from his store, which he probably tucked in his pocket till he assembled enough information, or possibly kept in the cash register drawer of his store until he could present it to the various members at a meeting, indicating what he found, the names, the requirements, and the constant repetition of his, "I would like to come to Newton if you can assure me that your Hebrew school children are well behaved." I don't know about that. What attracted Jews to Mount Freedom was probably the same thing that attracted all the rest of the Jews to Morris and Sussex: economic opportunity. In this case, farmland was purchased once again by Baron de Hirsch moneys from Baron Maurice de Hirsch, an Austrian well-to-do businessman who had decided that when Jews settled in America, that in his mind he felt that farming was a worthy occupation, that Jews would do well to return to the earth. In any event, land was purchased, and in 1903, the first settlers to this little community, this isolated community that was named Mount Freedom by George Washington, as the history relates, actually originally Walnut Grove before it became Mount Freedom, Yetta and Max Levine put all their belongings onto the horse and wagon, and they made their way from Brooklyn, New York, to Morristown, stayed the night at one of Morristown's founding synagogue families, the Domes, and eventually got up in the morning and made their way up the hill to what is now referred to as Mount Freedom. What you see here on the top, because that follows the sequence of the way we're going through the exhibition, is the synagogue building in 2002. This is the sanctuary that you came to visit today, but originally the synagogue was a small 22 by 40 white clapboard structure that sat in a field and on a snowy day seemed quite isolated, almost like the few handfuls of Jewish families that first settled in the area. But the effort to build that synagogue is well documented in oral histories. It was quite wonderful. Even children in the community raised their pennies with the purpose of establishing a formal congregation. What also happened was the same thing that happened in Pinebrook, but on a larger level. Actually, actually to compete with what is probably more familiar or more recorded in history, the Catskills, or the kosher hotels that developed in the Catskills. These hotels that I'm about to talk about preceded the activity because when these hotels opened in the 1920s and 30s, there was no New York Thruway. So they pretty much cornered the market for Jews looking for an escape for the summer months. And starting in May, all the way to the Jewish holidays, Jews from Newark, from South Orange, from Philadelphia, from surrounding communities, made their way to Mount Freedom's kosher hotels. You see them here, and I think it's worthy of mentioning them. Salt's, and an aerial view of Salt's hotel, which shows you it's really quite an extensive complex. The Saints Hotel, the Plaza, where there was all-night gambling, which is quite a wonderful story, as was relayed to me by a former resident. Pine Hill Lodge, where singles met, Lieberman's House, the Claude Hotel, Ackerman's, and because history did not preserve, but needs mention, Tenzer Hotel. There is constant interest in the history of Mount Freedom's hotels, the kosher hotels that service Jews in the area. It even appears in a recent feature story in Morristown's Daily Record, which is the paper of record for Morris County, and the date is August 2nd, 2002. Even email is generated to the library, offering information, offering manuscripts, and also inquiring about various points in history that someone wanted to pick up because they were doing some personal genealogical family research, and they felt that would be a way to get some information that nobody remembered anymore. Much like Pinebrook and Morristown and Newton, Mount Freedom also established a congregational cemetery. It had early on, just like we study about in many small communities, a one-room schoolhouse divided in half. On one side, grades 1 to 4. On the other side, grades 5 to 8. What is interesting about this photograph is that in this one-room schoolhouse, we get a sense of the presence of Jews just by the percentage of Jewish students that were attending. The year is 1928. 25% of the class would have been Jewish students. Mount Freedom even had a Jewish postmistress, which is also a nice story as related to me by her daughter. And her name is Jenny Kapner, who got the job in 1941 for $900 a year. And she thought it was pretty swell again because the money was well needed. Finally, in the step of synagogues as they opened their doors, not necessarily when the communities would have settled, was Dover Jewish Center. Originally Adat Israel, it was referred to commonly by everybody in the area as the Dover Jewish Center. Dover Jewish Center opens its doors in 1936. It opened on Orchard Street to the top left here, the brick facade. But the efforts to construct this building started in 1917. It was slow and it was hard raising the money. But in this photograph, you will see the significant, actually the benefactors of the Dover Jewish Center, celebrating their 50th anniversary at the Dover Center. In 1946, they are Bella and Max Youngelson, who, if we travel across the board, you will see their store, Youngelson's department store, taken somewhere around 1910. It's quite charming to see the young boy seated on the fire hydrant. And of course, other things will, just shape the history. And once again, tucked in the corner, maybe a little difficult to see, you would see a list of Jewish merchants because, as in the case of the other 4 communities with concentrated Jewish business districts, Dover also did the same on what was referred to as Blackwell Street. But I should return to the story of the synagogue because it has a moment to it. Apparently, Mrs. Youngelson, or Bella, had somehow, I guess in the role of her stocking, because that was somewhat, an early image, had sequestered $5,000 that, based on several oral histories, we do not think her husband knew about. And when it came time, she decided to present this $5,000 to what was a very informal congregation, which met, like many did, as all did early on, in various private homes for minions, and rented halls and stores for holidays, and so forth. She presented the $5,000, and as the history is related, this little lady was really quite wonderful in terms of everybody's respect and consideration, in terms of her memory. had collected every Thursday or Erev Shabbat, maybe Friday morning. She made the trip up and down Blackwell Street because she worked in her husband's business, and she literally insisted that the Jewish merchants keep contributing. The expression was just give, give, give. And she spearheaded the movement to establish the Dover Jewish Center. The history of Dover is rich. It was built on iron ore and the Morris Canal. It was built that way because miners also, much like Franklin, came to settle, and the Jewish merchants followed because once again, they were there to offer the goods and services, and it was also an amicable setting. Memories are told for those who have an opportunity to see the exhibition a little closer, and I should interject at this moment that this is a traveling exhibition, and anyone interested certainly can contact the Jewish Historical Society, and we would be happy to make arrangements to put it in place for others to see and possibly get a closer view of what I'm talking about. But memories have been written by former residents, and the events that were conducted are reflected. The businesses that go back 103 years, at least from 2002, all belonging to early Dover settlers Leopold D. Schwartz and quite successful Heller family, Max and Jenny Heller and their children, who went on to have various real estate enterprises, and in this case of Mr. Heller, even establishing Dover Trust Bank, which eventually became in 2002 Fleet Bank through a series of mergers. But in general, you get a sense that the progress was interesting. The history is rich and varied. It was farmland, it was market, it was mining community, and all were good to America and America good to them. Taking across the theme and ending at Dover, we should continue on to Dover till the conclusion. Dover's Jews established themselves in Dover in 1869. That's when we have the first Jews arriving. One of the individuals, or actually two of Dover's gentlemen, decided that they had an invention that they were willing to put together, of which you see here. What I'm talking about is, if I raise or I lower, you can see the eyepieces on this. This is the Brewster Heller Armor Protector. It's here because it is a bit of Americana, a bit of military memorabilia. I shouldn't say memorabilia, but military history. And it was invented by two men from Dover. The gentleman who invented it, you see here, he is wearing this prototype, and the day and the year are April 25th, 1917, the day that Guy Otis Brewster and the small inset here, Emil Heller, demonstrated their armor protector to the United States War Department. 3 bags of documents that have been sitting in the basement, quite musty to take out and look at, fully cover the story from day one, all the way from 1915 to 1942. There is rich, copious correspondence, publicity, and newspaper articles dealing with the Brewster Heller Armor Protector. Some of it has been copied. The documents, you can see just by the shading on the paper, are so fragile that they could not be exhibited or really handled too frequently. So they've been duplicated for the purpose of standing and reading, and if you pay a little attention to it, you will get the full background. But it suffices to say that these gentlemen can put this prototype of armor protector. The idea was to sell it to the United States War Department. The patent had been granted, and the price was $600,000. Well, to make a long story short, there never really was a deal. But we don't know what's going to happen to our Brewster Heller Armor Protector. Only history will tell, but there are a few ideas that have been put into motion. We shall see. And if you are following this along and you'd like to inquire about it, we'd be happy to tell you a little bit more. We have several showcases of original documents. Of course, we would not put them on the boards. Everything that you see on the boards are really copies of the originals. But if we follow the showcases that have been set up for the exhibition, we'll finish with the Dover theme. You know, many times exhibitions are a case of materials that come to you. And in this case, we had a gentleman in the Dover community whose family had been there for 4 generations. His great-grandfather was the first Dover settler. The last name is Schwartz. And Sidney and Ethel Schwartz had held on to for many, many years until our society opened its doors in 1991, various photographs from Dover's Jewish community. And hopefully you will be able to distinguish them, but then again, remember this exhibition travels and you can see them up close and personal. I have assorted photographs from a social organization to your extreme left called the Unity Club, which was a social group in Dover. All the activities, anybody could join, and I think they had a very good time. The descriptions of the card games and the various sociable occasions were really quite endearing, especially the way they were written. It was everything happening in the Jewish community. You would read about it or you could attend. And there was a touch of history as well. In 1919, Dover was just as responsive to the war as any place else in the United States, and I should backtrack and say that there is a distinguished record of Jews in Morris and Sussex that is well documented, all their activities in support of all the wars that have been, I'm trying to find the words, that Americans have had to endure. But you see a 1919 photograph and assorted souvenirs and programs from a dance that's called Farewell to Men in Service, and most of Dover's crowd is there, and probably quite a few people from the area as well, because Dover, like Morristown, had a full-service Jewish center and attracted Jews that did not have such opportunities. And last but not least, for the Dover Showcase, there is a photograph honoring Alexander Davis. The occasion is 50 years of service to the Congregational Cemetery. Dover established a Congregational Cemetery, Dover Mount Sinai. I have to read it for a second. Dover Mount Sinai Cemetery Association, and it exists today. It's a small, intimate cemetery, and it is supervised by a board, as are by a volunteer board, as are the rest of the congregational cemeteries. The last stop at Dover is a ledger that possibly you would not be able to read, but I will tell you that these are the oldest documents that have been made available or donated to the Society for Morris and Sussex Jewish History. The ledger is a minutes ledger from the Dover Jewish community, or as they refer to themselves, as a group of Dover Israelites. And the first page is the date when my history truly begins, that I can really touch, is October 4th, 1882. Next to it is a burial ledger. I have 8 cubic feet of burial ledgers and information that deal with the start, even to the deposition to purchasing land for the Beth Israel Cemetery, or what was originally the Morristown Hebrew Cemetery, located in Cedar Knolls, and the members of the congregation and the Chevra Kaddish, or the burial society that took care of the facility, anything you had to know. And it's quite interesting reading, just in terms of discovering where Jews came from originally, and all the things that you can discover about a community just by reading its burial and cemetery information. The same information that is given for the burial for congregants for synagogues, congregational cemeteries, is duplicated in this Newton ledger, also for Newton's cemetery in Hardyston, which is in Sussex County. Moving to here, I've shared the showcase with Franklin and with Newton because they are close to each other geographically. Conveniently or interestingly, while I'm busy working on finding the history of Morris and Sussex Jews, the New Jersey Historical Society published an interesting article, From Womb to Tomb, that was issued in its fall publication, and it has to do just with the history of Franklin. And although it may be difficult to discern, in the lower left-hand corner there is a photograph of Estelle and Edward Mindlin. And if you remember from earlier on in the conversation, you know that the Mindlins were the first Jewish family to settle in Franklin, and I think probably sad to say they are the last Jews living in Franklin in 2002. There are assorted memorabilia from the various shops that were on Main Street in Franklin, and a ledger of the Y and events, Jewish events and activities from Newton, and a little more synagogue memorabilia from Newton. And tucked to the right top was this unique, I guess, discovery in my field. I caught my imagination was this holiday ticket inviting, the owner of the card or the person who purchased the ticket to the high holiday service to Newton's first congregation, which was then known as Congregation Reuben Shimon, and those who are able to read Yiddish will understand that the top comes across, says Congregation Reuben Shimon, but I have no date, but I'm estimating it would be somewhere around 1934. And finally, we move on to my last showcase, because I have samples of my farming communities. Jews were not only merchants, they were farmers. And in the case of the gentleman who possibly you can see, an older gentleman holding the hand of his granddaughter, Sydney, his father had opened up Center Grove Dairy, which is on Center Grove Road in Randolph. And I'm going to backtrack on that. Yes, it is Center Grove Dairy, yes. And the daughter-in-law of the gentleman at Benson Cone, because you can see the sign here that says Cone Farm, bought 40 acres off of Center Grove Road and established his dairy. And what may be hard to discern, I did not have access to the original objects, just photographs, you would see the milk bottle that was used by Mr. Cone, a Benson Cone, in 1921 for the purpose of delivering his milk that was produced at his dairy, and the egg carton that came from his orchard farm business. The interesting thing that I would explain to you, because it would be difficult possibly to pick up from the video, is the fact that the milk bottle was embossed with a Magan David, which is the Jewish star, and inside was just the name B. Cone. Now, Mr. Cone took an interesting twist on the fact that he was a very observant Jew, and he felt this was an appropriate way for him to, I guess, take a position on the fact that he maintained this particular Orthodox tradition. The only difference is that in a moment of history, we know from reading the records and the documents of Jews living in Mount Freedom in the early 1920s, that while Mr. Cone was delivering his milk bottles with his Jewish star, there were burnings of crosses on the lawns, because as Jews started to arrive in numbers, many of the Gentile neighbors were uncomfortable with the concept or the prospect of having too many Jewish neighbors too close at hand. But Mr. Cone was not put off by any of this. He just had his position. And another story that I think is quite charming and should be noted is that when the Cones, as you see the name on the farm sign as you drive by in 2002, it is not the name at all. The name really, when the family left Russia, was Stoliar. And the Stoliars were, according to Jewish tradition, Kohens, which is something that would require additional explanation, but quite respected according to Jews and I mentioned religious tradition or biblical tradition. The Stoliars, or Mr. Cone, but B. Cone, changed his name when he came here. He changed it to Cone because he did not want his children to forget that they were Kohanim. Next to Mr. Cone, the older gentleman here is Farmer Al Cone, as he is known today, are a series of other items, memorabilia from Mount Freedom as well. One of the residents and someone who grew up in Morristown was nice enough to give us, maybe hard to read, a copy of the school newspaper, which was called the Mount Freedom Times. And we thought it would be a nice idea that if you wanted to read the history of Mount Freedom, at least through the eyes of a 6th, 7th, and 8th grader in 1935, you could do so by reading the school newspaper. This is just a sampling of what has been gathered to represent the history of Jews living in Morris and Sussex. What I would like to say about it is that this was a rich and varied history. The Jews who came and settled, raised their children, and America was good to them, and they were good to America. I hope you enjoy the exhibition, and I hope that you will be interested, and we welcome all inquiries. Do not hesitate to call us. And once again, it is the Jewish Historical Society of Metro West, and thank you for spending time with us.